Disclaimer.
This is AG, and I just watched the most expensive magic trick in modern finance. While America stared at a courtroom on Monday, 50 million barrels of oil quietly vanished into U.S. control on Tuesday, worth up to $3 billion. Let me walk you through what actually happened this week, because this isn't just about Venezuela. What unfolded between Monday and Tuesday is a playbook that could reshape how our country handles resource-rich nations under sanctions. And if you've got investments in energy, commodities, or international markets, you need to know what just went down. Picture this. Monday morning, every major news outlet in America is covering the same story. Nicolas Maduro, the man who's run Venezuela for over a decade, stands in a Manhattan courtroom calling himself a prisoner of war. His wife sits in the gallery with bruised ribs from his dramatic capture just days earlier. The cameras are rolling, the headlines are writing themselves, and America is watching what looks like the most significant international legal drama in years. But here's what you need to understand. While everyone was focused on that courtroom in Manhattan, the real story was happening somewhere completely different. And by the time most Americans figured it out, billions of dollars in Venezuelan oil had already changed hands. Monday started exactly how you'd expect a high-profile international arrest to play out. Maduro pleads not guilty in federal court, facing charges that could keep him locked up for decades. His legal team makes the expected moves. They hire David Colin, the same attorney who represented Julian Assange, and has a track record of cutting deals with U.S. prosecutors when the evidence gets overwhelming. The judge denies bail, sets the next hearing for March 17th, and Maduro gets transferred to a Brooklyn detention center where he'll sit while his lawyers prepare what everyone knows will be a years-long legal battle. Think about what a case like this actually looks like in practice. We're talking about classified evidence that triggers special procedures under the Classified Information Procedures Act, which means sealed hearings, redacted documents, and endless pretrial motions. His defense team will argue sovereign immunity, that he can't be prosecuted for actions taken as a head of state. According to legal experts who've handled similar cases, we're looking at a trial date sometime in 2027 at the earliest, possibly later, if appeals drag it out. The media coverage on Monday was exactly what you'd predict. Every cable news network ran the same footage of Maduro in handcuffs, the same courthouse steps commentary, the same legal analysis about what charges he faces and what happens next. His wife's bruised ribs from the capture became a human interest angle. The fact that he called himself a prisoner of war gave commentators hours of material to dissect. It was compelling television, the kind of story that dominates news cycles. And that's precisely why Tuesday evening's announcement caught almost everyone off guard. While Americans were still processing Monday's courtroom drama, President Trump made a statement that should have been the lead story on every financial news network in the country. Venezuela, he announced, would be turning over 30 to 50 million barrels of oil immediately to the United States. Not eventually, not after negotiations, not pending court outcomes. Immediately. The oil was already sitting on storage ships, ready to dock at U.S. facilities, with all proceeds to be controlled directly by the president. Let me put those numbers in perspective for you. At current prices of $55 to $56 per barrel, we're talking about an instant seizure worth between $1.65 and $2.8 billion. This isn't some theoretical future asset or negotiated settlement years down the road. This is oil that's already floating on tankers, heading to our docks right now. Here's where the timing gets really interesting. Venezuela's total oil storage capacity is about 48 million barrels. And, according to industry data from S&P Global Commodity Insights, those storage facilities were nearly full. The country has been pumping oil but struggling to sell it under sanctions, so they've been filling up every available tank and floating storage vessel they could access. What Trump announced on Tuesday wasn't seizing some hypothetical future production. It was taking inventory that already existed, oil that Venezuela desperately needed to keep their economy functioning. Energy Secretary Chris Wright received orders to execute this plan immediately. Not to study it, not to negotiate terms, not to wait for court proceedings to conclude. Execute immediately. And according to senior administration officials speaking to Reuters, that execution is already underway. The crude is moving to U.S. Gulf Coast refineries as we speak. Think about the split-screen reality here for a moment. On Monday, Maduro's lawyers are filing motions, arguing jurisdictional issues, preparing for what everyone expects will be a marathon legal case that stretches for years. The courtroom has all the trappings of due process, a federal judge, proper legal representation, scheduled hearings stretching months into the future. It looks like the American justice system doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Meanwhile, on Tuesday, the actual assets that matter, the oil that keeps Venezuela's economy alive, are being transferred to U.S. control while Maduro sits in a Brooklyn detention center without any way to stop it. The court case becomes almost decorative at that point, a legal proceeding that will eventually conclude while the economic consequences are already locked in and irreversible. Senior administration officials told Bloomberg that the transfer is happening quickly because the crude is very heavy and can't be stored indefinitely without degrading. In other words, this wasn't just strategically timed. It was operationally necessary to move fast. The oil was sitting there, ready to be taken, and waiting for courts to sort everything out would have meant watching billions of dollars in assets literally deteriorate. For those of us watching energy markets, this should raise some serious questions about what we just witnessed. The Venezuela case establishes something new, a precedent where the legal proceedings and the asset seizures operate on completely different timelines. The courtroom provides the appearance of due process, while the actual economic consequences happen at executive speed. And here's what should really grab your attention. Venezuela's total current oil production runs about 800,000 barrels per day according to OPEC data. The 30 to 50 million barrels Trump announced represents roughly 1 to 2 months of their entire national production, handed over in a single transaction. That's not a sanction, not a gradual pressure campaign, not a negotiated settlement. That's an instant transfer of wealth that fundamentally changes Venezuela's economic position overnight. The question you should be asking yourself right now is simple. If this is how quickly things can move when our government decides to seize resources from a sanctioned nation, what does that mean for the next target? Because there's always a next target in geopolitics, and the precedent being set this week in Venezuela doesn't stay limited to Venezuela. We'll get to what happened on Friday, when Trump hosted America's biggest oil executives at the White House to discuss exactly that question. But first, you need to understand what happened in the 24 hours between Monday's defiant speeches and Tuesday's cooperation, because that story reveals who's really running Venezuela right now, and it's not the person Americans think is in charge. Here's where things get really interesting, because while Maduro was sitting in a Brooklyn detention center on Monday, someone else was getting sworn in to run Venezuela. Her name is Delcy Rodriguez, and what she did in the next 24 hours is one of the most remarkable political pivots you'll ever see. Monday afternoon in Caracas, Rodriguez takes the oath of office as Venezuela's new interim president. The ceremony is broadcast live on state television, and she delivers exactly the kind of speech you'd expect from someone who just had their country's leader arrested by a foreign power. She tells the Venezuelan people that they rule their country, that no one else has that authority. She declares 7 days of national mourning for the more than 50 people killed during the operation that captured Maduro. Her message is clear and defiant. Venezuela will resist American aggression. The imagery from that Monday broadcast was powerful. Rodriguez, standing before Venezuelan flags, flanked by military officers, speaking directly to a nation in shock. She condemned what she called a brutal violation of sovereignty, promised that Venezuela would never bow to external pressure, and positioned herself as the leader who would defend the nation's independence. According to reports from Venezuelan state media, the speech was replayed throughout the evening on every government-controlled channel. Now let me ask you something. What would you expect to happen next? If you're Rodriguez, you just gave that speech to your entire country. You've staked your legitimacy on defending Venezuelan sovereignty. You've declared mourning for citizens killed in an operation you're calling an act of aggression. Your Interior Minister, Diosdado Cabello, is telling international media that anti-American sentiment is rising to unprecedented levels across Venezuela. So what does Rodriguez do on Tuesday? She coordinates the transfer of 30 to 50 million barrels of Venezuelan oil directly to U.S. control. The same oil Trump announced would be turned over immediately by what he specifically called interim authorities. That's not language Trump's team made up. That's the formal title Rodriguez holds. Interim president. And according to senior administration officials who briefed Reuters, the transfer is happening with full cooperation from those interim authorities. Think about the split-screen reality here for a moment. On Monday night, Venezuelan citizens are watching their new president on television, mourning their dead, hearing promises that their country will never surrender to American demands. On Tuesday morning, that same president is working with U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright to execute the largest single oil transfer in Venezuelan history, with all proceeds going directly to accounts controlled by President Trump. This isn't a slow policy shift that happened over weeks or months. This is a complete reversal that happened overnight, literally between one sunset and the next sunrise. And it raises a question that should concern anyone paying attention to international finance. When Rodriguez speaks to Venezuelans on state television, who is she actually representing? Interior Minister Cabello keeps giving interviews about rising anti-American sentiment, about how the Venezuelan people are unified in their resistance. Meanwhile, the oil that keeps Venezuela's economy functioning is flowing to U.S. Gulf Coast refineries at Rodriguez's direction. According to Bloomberg sources inside the administration, the crude is heading specifically to facilities where it will be refined and sold, with Trump maintaining direct control over every dollar generated. But here's where it gets even more complicated. Because Rodriguez isn't just managing a domestic political crisis, she's also dealing with Venezuela's largest trading partner, and they're watching billions of dollars disappear in real time. China has invested heavily in Venezuela's oil sector over the past 2 decades, and those investments are structured around a simple deal. Venezuela sends crude to Chinese refineries, and China gets paid back for the loans and infrastructure projects they've funded. According to data from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, Venezuela has been shipping about 470,000 barrels per day to China, which represents roughly 68% of Venezuela's total oil exports. Do the math on what that means at current prices. 470,000 barrels per day times $55 per barrel times 365 days equals about $9.4 billion annually. But Venezuela owes China significantly more than that because of accumulated debt from years when production was higher and oil prices were lower. Chinese government estimates put Venezuela's total debt to China at around $12 billion. Now, Rodriguez is redirecting that oil. Instead of heading to Chinese refineries, it's going to U.S. Gulf Coast facilities. And this isn't some future hypothetical scenario. This is happening right now, this week, as we speak. Senior administration officials confirmed to multiple outlets that the Venezuelan crude will go to U.S. facilities in the Gulf to be refined, which means Chinese state-owned companies are watching their primary source of repayment get rerouted to American control. Here's what makes this particularly interesting from a financial perspective. Venezuelan heavy crude sells at a significant discount when it goes to China because of the debt repayment structure. China essentially takes the oil as payment for what Venezuela owes. But when that same crude goes to U.S. Gulf Coast refineries, which are specifically designed to process heavy sour crude, Venezuela can command closer to market prices. According to energy analysts at S&P Global, this shift could nearly triple the per-barrel revenue Venezuela receives. So theoretically, this should be great for Venezuela's economy, right? Higher prices, better refineries, more efficient processing. Except there's one crucial detail. Trump controls all the proceeds. Every dollar generated from refining and selling that oil goes into accounts managed directly by the U.S. president. Venezuela isn't seeing any of that increased revenue. They're watching their most valuable export generate record income that they can't access. Rodriguez is walking an impossible tightrope here, and you can see the strain in how the messaging has evolved throughout the week. On Monday, it's all defiance and sovereignty and resistance. By Tuesday, the tone shifts to emphasizing Venezuela's cooperation with international norms and commitment to diplomatic solutions. By Wednesday, government officials are telling anyone who will listen that the oil transfer is a temporary measure to ensure orderly markets during a transitional period. But Venezuelans aren't stupid. They can see what's happening. Interior Minister Cabello keeps insisting that anti-American sentiment is rising, and he's probably not wrong about that. When your country, his leadership gives speeches about sovereignty on Monday and then hands over billions in oil assets on Tuesday, people notice the contradiction. And when China, your largest trading partner and primary source of international support, is watching $12 billion in debt repayment vanish into U.S. control, that creates a whole different level of geopolitical complexity. The fascinating part is how Rodriguez is managing to maintain both positions simultaneously. She's telling Venezuelans that she's defending their sovereignty while coordinating the largest resource transfer in their nation's recent history. She's positioning herself to the U.S. as a cooperative partner who can deliver results while maintaining enough domestic credibility to keep the Venezuelan government functioning. And she's somehow keeping Chinese officials engaged in conversations even as their primary revenue stream gets redirected to American refineries. According to diplomatic sources quoted by the Financial Times, Chinese foreign ministry officials have made at least 3 attempts to reach Rodriguez directly since Tuesday's announcement. Those calls haven't been returned yet. Meanwhile, U.S. Energy Secretary Wright has had multiple conversations with Venezuelan officials about logistics, timing, and refinery capacity. That tells you everything you need to know about where Rodriguez's priorities actually lie, regardless of what she's saying on Venezuelan state television. When you're choosing which phone calls to return and which to ignore, you're revealing who actually has leverage over your decisions. And right now, despite all the rhetoric about resistance and sovereignty, Rodriguez is very clearly responding to Washington, not Beijing. This creates a precedent that should concern anyone watching international energy markets. If interim authorities in a sanctioned nation can redirect massive oil shipments this quickly, based purely on pressure from the country imposing those sanctions, what does that mean for energy security everywhere? What does it mean for countries that rely on trade relationships with nations under U.S. sanctions? And perhaps most importantly, if China just watched $12 billion in debt repayment disappear because Rodriguez chose cooperation with Washington over honoring commitments to Beijing, how does that change China's calculations about lending to other resource-rich nations in the future? These aren't abstract questions. These are issues that will directly impact energy prices, commodity markets, and international trade flows for years to come. And they all stem from what Rodriguez did in those 24 hours between Monday's defiant speech and Tuesday's oil transfer. But the story doesn't end there. because while Rodriguez was performing her balancing act, Trump was already planning the next move. And on Friday, he invited the people who would actually benefit from all this Venezuelan oil to the White House to discuss exactly how big this opportunity could get. Friday, January 9th. While most Americans were wrapping up their work week, President Trump hosted executives from Exxon, Chevron, and ConocoPhillips at the White House. These are not just random oil companies. These are the three largest American energy corporations with historical operations in Venezuela, companies that had billions in assets, nationalized by previous Venezuelan governments, companies that have been waiting years for an opportunity to get back into that market. Now, the timing of this meeting should tell you everything you need to know about what just happened. Trump doesn't announce the 30 to 50 million barrel seizure on Tuesday and then randomly decide on Friday to invite oil executives over for coffee. This meeting was scheduled well in advance, which means those executives knew what was coming before the rest of us did. The Tuesday announcement wasn't the main event. It was the proof of concept. Think about what Trump needed to demonstrate to get these executives interested in a massive Venezuela investment. He needed to show them that our government can actually seize oil inventory, can actually control the proceeds, and can actually make the economics work despite all the geopolitical complexity. The 30 to 50 million barrels served as evidence that the infrastructure exists, the legal framework holds up, and Rodriguez will cooperate regardless of what she says on Venezuelan television. According to sources familiar with the meeting who spoke to the Wall Street Journal, the executives came to the White House to discuss terms for restoring Venezuela's oil production to 2 million barrels per day. That's more than double where Venezuela is currently producing, and getting there would require about $110 billion in investment, according to industry estimates. But here's what's critical. None of those executives would even consider that kind of investment without seeing proof that the U.S. government can actually control Venezuelan resources. Tuesday's announcement provided that proof. And Friday's meeting was about negotiating how the appetizer turns into the main course. Let me break down what 30 to 50 million barrels actually represents, because these numbers matter if you're trying to understand the scale of what just happened. Venezuela's current production runs about 800,000 barrels per day according to OPEC's latest figures. That means 30 million barrels equals roughly 37 days of total national production. 50 million barrels equals about 62 days. In a single announcement, Trump secured between 1 and 2 months of Venezuela's entire oil output. But it gets more interesting when you look at what else got seized. Senior administration officials confirmed to Reuters that beyond the storage inventory, there are tankers already in transit carrying between 15 and 22 million barrels of Venezuelan crude that were destined for other buyers. Those tankers are now being redirected to U.S. Gulf Coast facilities. So you're looking at a combined seizure of somewhere between 45 and 72 million barrels when you add everything together. Venezuela's total storage capacity is 48 million barrels, and according to S&P Global's analysis, those facilities were at roughly 90% capacity before Tuesday's announcement. That means Venezuela's strategic reserves, the oil they keep on hand to manage production flows, maintain operations during disruptions, and fulfill existing contracts, just got completely depleted. They're operating with essentially zero buffer now. And here's what should really grab your attention. A senior administration official admitted to Bloomberg that the transfer is happening quickly because the crude is very heavy and can't be stored long. In other words, this wasn't just strategically timed, it was operationally necessary. That Venezuelan heavy crude starts degrading if it sits too long, which means the seizure had to happen fast to preserve the asset value. Think about the position that puts Rodriguez in. She's got storage facilities that are suddenly empty, tankers that were supposed to deliver to paying customers but got redirected to U.S. refineries, and a domestic population that's being told this is all part of some orderly transitional arrangement. Meanwhile, the oil executives sitting in the White House on Friday are looking at a completely hollowed out storage infrastructure that they'll need to rebuild with that $110 billion investment. But Trump said something on Monday that I need you to understand because it explains exactly what precedent is being set here. He compared the Venezuela situation to Iraq and said, the difference between Iraq and this is Bush didn't keep the oil. We're going to keep the oil. That's not just a throwaway line. That's a policy statement about how our country will handle resource-rich nations under sanctions going forward. When the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, there were extensive debates about whether American companies would control Iraqi oil fields. Ultimately, the legal and political framework that emerged kept Iraqi oil under Iraqi control, with U.S. companies participating through service contracts and licensing agreements. It was a traditional model where the sovereign nation maintained ownership of its natural resources. What Trump just did in Venezuela is fundamentally different. This isn't a service contract or a licensing agreement. This is direct seizure of inventory with proceeds controlled by the U.S. president, followed by a White House meeting with executives to discuss long-term investment that would essentially put American companies in operational control of Venezuela's oil sector. And it all happened in 1 week, while Maduro sits in detention and Rodriguez coordinates the transfer. The 30 to 50 million barrels worth between $1.65 and $2.8 billion is proof that this model works. It demonstrates that our government can move this fast, can seize this much, and can make the economics function despite international objections. And once you've proven the model works on Venezuela, you've created a template that can apply anywhere. Iran has 208 billion barrels in proven reserves. That's the fourth largest oil reserves in the world. Iran has been under various U.S. sanctions for decades. And just this week, Trump threatened Colombia's President Petro with military action over a diplomatic dispute. You don't need to be a geopolitical analyst to see where this is heading. The Venezuela playbook is not staying limited to Venezuela. For those of us watching energy markets, this creates some serious questions about the future. If sovereign nations can have their oil reserves seized this quickly when they fall out of favor with Washington, what does that mean for energy security globally? What does it mean for the price of oil when supply can be redirected at executive speed? What does it mean for countries currently under sanctions who are watching Venezuela storage facilities get emptied in a week? And perhaps most importantly for you personally, what does this mean for your investments? If you're holding energy stocks, commodity futures, or international funds with exposure to resource-rich nations, the Venezuela precedent changes your risk calculations. The game isn't just about supply and demand anymore. It's about which governments can move fastest to control resources when geopolitical winds shift. The executives who met with Trump on Friday understand this better than anyone. They're not looking at Venezuela as a normal market opportunity where you negotiate with a sovereign government and work within their legal framework. They're looking at a situation where the U.S. government has demonstrated it can seize the inventory, control the proceeds, and clear the way for American companies to dominate the sector, all within 1 week of arresting the previous leadership. That's not capitalism. That's not even traditional imperialism. That's something new, a hybrid model where economic seizure happens at military speed, but gets packaged as legal process and diplomatic cooperation. And the fact that Rodriguez is helping coordinate it while giving speeches about Venezuelan sovereignty just proves how effective this model can be. So here's what you need to take away from everything that happened this week. Monday's courtroom drama wasn't the story. It was the cover for Tuesday's oil seizure. Rodriguez's 24-hour pivot from defiance to cooperation was not weakness. It was a demonstration of who actually controls Venezuela now. And Friday's White House meeting with oil executives wasn't about Venezuela's future. It was about establishing the template for every resource-rich sanctioned nation going forward. The magic trick I mentioned at the start, it wasn't magic at all. It was just a very well-executed sequence where everyone was looking at the courtroom while the real action happened with tankers, storage facilities, and White House meetings with oil executives. And now that you see how it was done, you can watch for the same pattern the next time our government decides a resource-rich nation needs regime change, because there will be a next time. The precedent is set. The model is proven. And 50 million barrels of Venezuelan oil sitting in U.S. refineries right now is all the proof anyone needs that when America wants your resources, the courtroom is just the distraction while the real work happens somewhere else entirely. This is AG, and I'll be watching what happens next. You should too. If this kind of financial intelligence helps you see what's really happening behind the headlines, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. It keeps me digging deeper into stories the mainstream misses. Stay sharp out there.